Good to see everyone. And here we are. This will be our last class of the semester. We'll take a few weeks off and pick up again on January 10th. So we'll take the next 3 Sundays off from class, and January 10th we'll reconvene. Jim looks like a Batman villain there. There he is. Okay. Slanted camera angle. But today we've got the wild and wonderful book of Judges. Let's start and see if anybody had any questions or comments before we dive into the text and everything. Bob.
As I was reading the Song of Deborah, down in verse 24, I find it not interesting, not jarring, but the juxtaposition between the line talking about Jael, the wife of Heber, who drove a nail into the head of the enemy general.
Right.
Says, blessed above women shall Jael, the wife of Heber the Canaanite, be. I compare that to the Magnificat, where Mary says, and blessed will I be among all women.
Yes, yes.
It just struck me. No,
there are some parallels. There are more parallels with the Song of Hannah, which we'll get to pretty soon. Next time, that'll be in 1 Samuel, Samuel's mother. But the Song of Deborah, there are some early things there. So yes, it's a cool juxtaposition. Though, of course, Jesus being born is much happier than tent pegs through the temple.
Yeah.
Well, unless you're fighting the guy that's nasty and then you want to get him pegged. So cool. Other thoughts, comments, or questions here? But we still have the question hanging out there. It was raised last time, I think, by John Oram. This is awfully violent stuff. The bigger difference this time with Joshua, the narrative shows God instructing and commanding the total warfare. In Judges, it's not quite as top down. God does want the people to protect themselves and defend themselves and all that, but we don't have the sense of total war that we had in the book of Joshua. As I mentioned last week too, Joshua was probably written with the theological intent of showing things. This is what happens when you obey God, and Judges is going to have a different agenda for the Deuteronomic historian, but we'll talk more about that in a second. Any other questions though before I dive in here? Okay, I'm going to put my screen up here in theory. Oh, got part of Facebook there. How's that? All right. So, what is that up? You don't realize how much you've got up on your desktop. So, here we are. So today we're going to tackle Judges. We're also going to tackle the wonderful little book of Ruth. They're very different books. Judges is part of the Deuteronomistic history. Ruth is a later story, maybe even a much later story. I tend to think it's a much later story. It's more of a short story. It's got kind of an O. Henry surprise twist ending to it, but we'll get back to that towards the end here. As we've talked about last week, this is probably the same school of thought as the book of Deuteronomy, the Deuteronomistic history, Joshua, Judges, and the books about Samuel and all the kings, Samuel, David, Solomon, and all the other kings, probably from the same school of thought. And along with the prophets, whom they also seem to collate, it's about 2/5 of the Old Testament, so a big chunk. And I've said this before, so this is repeat. Couple central overarching themes throughout, and this is throughout Deuteronomy and throughout the Deuteronomistic history. I need to slow down. I'm a little hyped up on caffeine and excitement from the lessons in Carol. So, central overarching theme: you got to be faithful to God. You got to be faithful to God's law, and if you are, good things will happen. And if you're not, it's not going to go well for you. And later on, they'll reflect on the reason we got wiped out by the Babylonians and by the Assyrians in the north is God allowed it to happen, not because he was weak, but because we weren't faithful. John, you got your hand up there.
Yes, Jim, I keep wondering, where does Job, the book of Job, come in as a counter force against the Deuteronomic school?
Yeah, when we get to Job, there is no solid answer. It could be one of the oldest writings in the Old Testament or one of the newer ones. And there are a raft of opinions. There are almost no clues within Job. And there are scholarly opinions saying from it's one of the oldest writings in the Old Testament to one of the most recent writings in the Old Testament. And so and Ruth has that to a lesser extent. We'll talk a little bit about that, but Job is even worse. So that's a great question. But it does push back a little bit on, on some of these themes, though in some ways it does overlap, but we'll get to that later on. Where it does overlap, I think, John, is sometimes God does allow things to happen to you. God might not be punishing you, but God will let things happen for various reasons. But that's a great question and not one that there's a great answer for. Last week, I also mentioned that as you get more into the books of Samuel and the books of Kings, you've got also the theme of the Davidic covenant, the house, the dynasty of King David coming up. And God having a special relationship. So, all right. We had this question with Joshua. Do we look at Judges as pure history or is it something else? With Joshua, it's as I said last week, it's that bridge between the period of Torah and the period of the kings, the monarchies. And the period of the monarchies tends to show up more in the historical record. The other stuff is more prehistoric in some ways. It overlaps with history, but there's not the same kind of historical record keeping to make it history in the way that we understand it in our modern world. Click back here. So I said last week also, Joshua seems to be the historian's attempt, the Deuteronomistic history's attempt to pull together many older stories, oral stories, and put them into a framework under the character of Joshua. And as I said last week, there's some pushback. Joshua seems to be a real guy, but is all this really something that Joshua did? There's pushback on that. But Judges, even more so, seems to be pulling a bunch of stories out from the oral tradition and probably not messing with them as much. So what we're probably getting here is pure nuggets and stories that haven't been reworked very much, if that makes sense. Joshua seems to be taking some of those older historical narratives and doing some work with them and shaping them. Judges seems to be more of a string of pearls, if you will, with these older stories, kind of presented almost as is. There's a little bit of ordering to them, but they're in a coherent whole, but they haven't been worked as much. They haven't been messed with as much. So we probably got some more original stuff here, if that makes sense to y'all. So far, so good. So when we get to the book of Judges, your book mentioned this. At the end of the book, you've got probably the key theological idea for the entire book. In those days, there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. So we've got kingship and monarchy in mind. Even though we have not hit that period historically, that's in the eye of the Deuteronomistic history. The kingship is coming and things will be different under a king, but we don't have a king now. And y'all, this is what happened when there wasn't a king. And basically it was chaos. And you can actually graph the book of Judges. The book of Judges starts here and it's just a steady, it's kind of a roller coaster down, but there's a downward trajectory the whole way. And things get worse and worse and worse and worse as you go through the book of Judges. Things just fall apart more and more and more. As Gates says, the center cannot hold, things fall apart. Well, that's what happens in Judges. There is no center, there is no king, except God, but we're a loose confederation politically, and God's it. So if you think about it, in a way, throughout the Bible, Judges is one of the most disunified books. There's absolutely no kind of ruling authority, earthly at least. With the patriarchs, you had a family system. There was a clear head of the family, the oldest male patriarch. And so there was some centralized authority, even though it was just a small tribal group, a small family group, a clan. With Moses, there was some unified authority. God appoints him. With Joshua, he's Moses' successor. And later with the monarchs, you'll have very much some unified authority, and some monarchs attempting to be even more unified and almost too unified and top down and heavy handed. But with judges, there's none of that. And we've got kind of these regional people, these regional figures that pop up, but they don't have authority over the entire nation. Maybe they can inspire people to come together and fight. But then after the time is done, everybody goes on about their merry way. So it really is a book of disunity more than anything else we've seen so far, or what we'll see later in the history of the Jewish people. And I said this last week, remember, we're not talking a nation state here. We are talking a very loose tribal confederation at this point. And these judges tend to rise up regionally. So they might rise up for a tribe. The book of Judges might say all of Israel, but the stories probably are indicative of a local guy rising up, or a local gal in Deborah's case, doing some things for a time and then kind of fading away, with the exception of Gideon and his son. We'll get to that in just a little bit. So this is not, we shouldn't think of this locked in nation state. King David's going to unify. This is going to be one big glob. This is going to be one solid chunk. Solomon is going to be one solid chunk. Then it will split into two kingdoms later. But during the time of Judges, we've got 12 very disparate, loosely affiliated tribal areas. And the other thing too is we also have that question here. Oh, let me go back to this slide first. So the other thing with Judges is if you strictly add up all the beads on the string, all the pearls, and how long the timeline is, it adds up to about 400 years. Historically, we're probably only talking about a 2-century window here with 400 years of stories. So that's probably also indicative of a couple things. One, that we've got some overlapping time periods. These are things happening in different tribal regions, and they might be happening at overlapping times. They're not one string, continuous narrative, continuous timeline. Also, a lot of the years, some of the years are very specific, like 7 year or 5 years or 4 years, but some of them are 20, 40, 80, general symbolic numbers, which often were used to mean a long time. And so we don't want to always take those numbers seriously as, 20 is not always 19 plus 1, 40 is not always 39 plus 1. A long time is what they're often referring to. But we're probably talking about a 2-century window here between the folks coming in from the Exodus and the rise of King Saul and King David. We said last week another thing that was happening in this period. There is very much in the archaeological record a rise in population of hill country villages, early Iron Age hill country villages in Israel. The outstanding question that archaeologists and historians are trying to answer is how many of them are Jewish, or what we will call Jewish, ethnically coming in? How many of them may be coming in from the Exodus? How many of them were already there and getting blended in and incorporated with these tribes coming in from the Exodus? And there probably, we talked about numbers last time, numbers of people, and there probably are fewer Jews than we usually think. Not 2.5 million folks coming in, probably a lot smaller number, thousands, not hundreds of thousands. But as they're there, the folks in the land also seem to be, they're ethnically related anyway, more distant cousins, but they tend to be unifying as tribes. And there is some push in the book of Exodus. It's not just the Jews who left Egypt. They had some other people with them that became part of their group. Well, probably that's also reflecting when they land in Israel, some other people are getting incorporated into the Jewish nation. So loose confederation, not nation state. All right. One last thing of background here. We've got a group that just pops up in Judges almost out of nowhere, who's going to be very important for a little while, all the way through the time of King David. A huge perennial enemy for Israel in the early days here, the Philistines. Who are these? We even talk about Philistines in English today as loutish, uncultured people. Well, they probably were more cultured than the Jews were, but that's another story. There are some other enemies on the other fringes. The Ammonites, the Moabites are off here in the east, in the desert across the Jordan, and they're still going to be an issue. We've had them cause problems before, but the Philistines down here on the coast are going to be a rising issue. There's lots of work about the Philistines historically and archaeologically. Looks like they're part of the Sea Peoples. Now, if you know anything about the Sea Peoples, you know they're a very mysterious bunch. They show up and try to invade Egypt out of nowhere, kind of almost like Viking raiders. We're not exactly sure who they are. In fact, there's a huge raft of opinions about them. The Bible doesn't say anything about where they came from. They're just there in these 5 city-states, Gezer, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Ekron. These 5 city-states are set up right on the coast here, the coastal plains. Just so you know, the Sea People, there are all kinds of theories about where they came from. That's way outside our purview. Some think, they used to think they came from Cyprus or maybe Crete, but maybe they came through Cyprus and Crete. Maybe they didn't originate from there. Maybe they came from Greece. Maybe they came from further up in Europe. We don't need to go there, but there is a wave of people that have come in and set up shop on the coast of Israel, by the sea, by the beautiful sea.
Jim?
Yes, Becky, go ahead.
And you may be about to get to this. So who are the descendants of the Philistines in our world?
Kind of, they kind of disappeared at this point. They've probably intermarried, interbred with all the folks in that region at this point, but they did not stick together. Their city names, actually, a couple of the cities are still on the map of Israel, but as a people, they've kind of dissipated. The Romans later called the place Palestine based on Philistia, but probably not for ethnic reasons strongly at that point.
Okay, thank you.
The other thing here that I just want to mention real quick, and this will be an issue for a while, we've got geographic issues here. The Philistines are here on the coastal plains, and the Israelites, originally with the book of Joshua, are really heavily here, and then they seem to be spreading out from there. So you've got kind of almost a standoff. The other thing is the Philistines are more high-tech. The Israelites are more low-tech. The Philistines are solidly into the Iron Age. The Jews seem to be still in the Bronze Age, technologically. From the side here, let's think about it this way. This is a side map. This is a modern map of Israel. Actually, 3 Philistine city-states are still going cities as far as names on the map in Israel 2020. Gaza Strip, Ashkelon, and Ashdod are still very much on the map here. But if you look here, you've got these central hills, and then the Philistines dominate these coastal plains. And the Jews kind of control this area, and the Philistines control this area. And part of that is technology. The Bible very clearly talks about the Philistines having these high-tech chariots of iron. Now, we have no idea what's the iron in the chariot. Was it iron rims on the wheels? Was it iron coats on the ends of the axles to keep the axles more protected? Was it armor plating? There are scholars who will defend all of those interpretations, but there's something Iron Age iron in Philistine chariots. So they're even better than Egyptian chariots. They're really high tech. They're not just tanks. They're not just cruddy tanks. They're high tech, computer-driven tanks. The best technology in the region. So very formidable indeed. But if we're talking about coastal plains, chariots are an awesome weapon. You drive up into the hills, less and less and less effective. So you almost have the idea of a standoff here. It's almost as if you've got the big standing army down on the coastal plains with the high-tech weapons, but the guerrilla fighters are up in the hills, and they can't come down to the plains and wipe out the Philistines because they're too strong, but the Philistines really can't. They lose their effectiveness if they go up in the hills. And so there's a real standoff here for centuries, basically, between these two groups. They have to coexist peacefully at times and are at war at other times. All right, before I get to the narrative, any other last minute questions? They will keep cropping up in Judges, in David, in Saul. They're going to be an issue until David finally gets them put down, but that's a long while. All right, probably too much on that. Okay, so Book of Judges. Wanted to talk about the book itself, the narrative, the stories. Remember, this is kind of a string of pearls that have been strung together by the Deuteronomistic historians. We start with Judges with this kind of theme of, okay, yeah, Joshua talked about conquering the entire land, but really, if you think about the land, they don't mention the book of Joshua and Judges, but God is allowing enemies to exist in Israel, in our midst, and on the fringes as a continuing test for us. So it's a theological idea that these other people are out there to see how faithful we'll be to God. And during this test time, which the entire book is going to turn out to be this test, what we have here is we've got these temporary leaders that arise as needed. They are termed judges. They occasionally have some judicial function, but really they're more military leaders. They're more charismatic military leaders that arise ad hoc for a brief time, for the most part, and then dissipate. And there's a continuing theme in Judges also that mentions that. So we've got kind of a basic formula here in the first part of Judges. The tribe of blank did not drive out the blanks, fill in the blank, Canaanites, Moabites, Ammonites among them. And then it goes through the whole list of all the tribes and the peoples that are still in the region. And so these people worship different gods. Some of them are being incorporated into the Jewish people and are worshiping the God of Israel. But remember, Jewish is kind of a anachronism at this point. Israel is a little bit of an anachronism. I use those terms, but they're not really what we think of in the solid way as they will be later. Hebrews might be the best word, but continuing test. Are you going to follow their gods, or are you going to be faithful to me? God is leaving them there. And so Judges very much has this pattern all the way through the book. The Israelites are faithful to God, to Yahweh. Then things kind of slip, they backslide, and God lets the enemies get more powerful, and it's kind of a wake-up call, and then God raises up a judge, and the Israelites are saved from the crisis that develops, and they're faithful for a while, but then they backslide, and the whole pattern cycles again and again and again in the book of Judges. This is very much a pattern. These charismatic figures pop up, but then things deteriorate some more. They get serious again, and God sends a judge to save them, and then on and on we go. It's a roller coaster, but it's continuing. There's no chain drive to get you back up to the top. But you have these little hills, but it's a trajectory that goes this way all the way through. All right, so we get some early judges mentioned in chapter 3. Othniel and Shagmar are very briefly mentioned. Ehud is mentioned. If you read him, he's probably the most graphic narrative in the book of Judges. It fringes on the Miller's Tale and the Canterbury Tales. Scatological humor seems to be involved, but it's a very lively narrative with lots of details to it. That Ehud the judge is left-handed, the first left-handed person you really hear mentioned in Scripture. Because of that, he hides the sword on the right side instead. He carries the sword on the opposite side, so when they frisk him to get into to see the king, they're not looking on the proper side because he's left-handed, and he's stashed the sword on the other side. And it's a short little sword, and he's alone with the king. He has got a message for the king, and he stabs the king with this short sword. It's actually very graphic, probably more graphic than the English translates it. The sword goes all the way through the king, and it actually opens up his bowels on the backside. And so there's kind of some scatological stuff. We don't have to go into great detail. And it talks about the fat of the king closing over the sword on the front side. And anyway, lots of detail. And then Ehud leaves and says, don't bother the king. He's resting. And you've got this humorous scene. The servants are out there waiting. Well, why doesn't he come out? Why doesn't he come out? Well, maybe he's going to the restroom in there. More scatological humor. Meanwhile, Ehud makes his escape. And okay, it's very, very, very graphic. Probably the most graphic of the Judges stories, and probably intended to be kind of some scatological wit and humor for the early Jews that preserved that story. So some brief Judges here. In chapter 4 and 5, we get the most unusual of the judges in that she is a she, the judge Deborah. She's called a judge, like the other guys later in the book, earlier in the book and later. She's also termed a prophet. There are not a lot of female prophets in the Bible, but there are some. In fact, Miriam carries that title. In the old days, they would translate it as prophetess, but there's really no real distinction. The word prophet applies to Deborah as much as it applies to Isaiah or Jeremiah or Miriam or Moses, or there's not that heavy distinction. And so she's a figure that arises. She is not a military leader. She rides into battle or goes into battle with the troops, though she's not the commanding general in the war, but she does have a quasi-military role. I think kind of a quasi-Joan of Arc type, an early Joan of Arc prototype. And really, as Bob asked about, Jael earlier is mentioned in the Song of Deborah as well. Jael, another woman, actually takes out the enemy general with a tent peg through his temple. There's a lot of feminist scholarship about this particular story and about Deborah's story too. There's really some infantilizing behavior. Jael is almost losing his manhood because he's scared. He runs into the tent to hide. And what does she do? She tucks him under a rug or a blanket. I'm going to tuck you in and give you a warm blankie. And he asks for some water, and she gives him warm milk. This is probably very intentional, that he's acting like a little kid, a little baby. And then, mommy, can you watch for the bad guys while I take a nap? Yes, okay. So there's probably some very much, the general's not very manly, robust guy. He's acting like a little kid. And while he's sleeping, she puts a tent peg right through his skull. There are some scholars, they probably go a little too far. I was reading one thing that Jael penetrates General Sisera, that it's supposed to be a sexual thing. I think that's probably going a little too far. But there is that out there too, that not only is he infantilized, maybe he's emasculated in some ways, and that's probably part of this, though I think that last piece was a little too much. But then Deborah does have a long song of triumph that takes up basically chapter 5 for the most part. And there's a lot of thoughts that maybe this was the first thing that really got recorded in writing in the Old Testament, that these other things were being passed down. But there are some scholars, a lot of scholars, that think this is the earliest written piece that ever got preserved in writing itself before other stories got written down. So that's kind of a fascinating piece. So Deborah, kind of an early feminist narrative, interestingly, in the midst of this period of Judges, with some very anti-female stuff that's going to happen later on as well. Thoughts or questions or comments so far? All right, then we get to the figure of Gideon. Gideon, we have the expression Gideon's trumpet. What's that about? Well, Gideon is an interesting figure. He's from a weak clan, and he's young, but God is raising him up very much to fight idolatry. In one of the wonderful scenes, God is trying to show how powerful he is in this. You don't need a big army. Let's look at the way the army you've got are drinking. Are they sticking their face into the creek, or are they picking the water up and sucking it out of their hands, lapping it out of their hands? Let's send the guys that put their faces into the water home. We don't need that many. We can get by with a much smaller army than that. It's kind of that's interesting. We don't need no big army to fight these people because God's on our side. So God is telling Gideon to send these people home. It's a very shrewd solution. He attacks at night. He has the guys show up with torches hidden inside clay jars, so the light is shielded. And at the same moment, they're surrounding the camp. They blow trumpets. They break the jars. All the guys in the camp are completely confused, and a lot of them kill each other in the confusion. They do a lot of the work for Gideon and his army by taking each other out. And then Gideon and his guys clean up the mess on the fringes. So it's a very witty. Wit is prized in these cultures, and Gideon is witty and brilliant, and it's a great solution. Good victory that way. However, there is a problem with the Gideon cycle, and that is Abimelech. Gideon's son. Gideon's son is no Gideon. He, in fact, will murder his brothers to try to solidify some power base. He doesn't want his family to fade away like the rest of the pattern in Judges. He wants to start a dynasty. And eventually Abimelech is killed in battle during a siege. Another woman killing, interestingly, a woman drops a rock on him, and he begs to be taken out with a sword so it won't be said he got killed by a woman. But there's some theological subtext here. And that subtext is it's not right. It's not the right time yet for the king. God has not ordained the time for kings to arise in Israel. And when it does happen, y'all, it's not going to be the guy proclaiming himself as the new king of all the people. It's like being emperor of North America. I could say I'm emperor of North America, and there have been several people who have claimed to be emperor of North America in history, but nobody's recognized that, and it certainly doesn't come top down. Same thing we've got here. Just because they say they're king doesn't mean they're king. That needs to be something God authorizes later on. So Abimelech is taken down after behaving kind of badly. So a negative picture of a judge here. The judges have all been witty and good so far, but the judge's son, Abimelech, not so good. We're starting that slide down. Okay, so bad judge, identical slide. All right. Downward trajectory, and that will snowball as we go on through Judges. All right, so then in chapter 9 through 10, I didn't highlight this in red, missed that. We've got a set of assorted judges. Most of them are mentioned by name. Kind of the one bigger story in there is Jephthah. And this is kind of a tough story. There are other stories that are similar in other cultures. In fact, I think there's some Greco-Roman story, Greek myth about a king that does a similar thing. But Jephthah promises he's so happy he won the battle after being a judge that he'll sacrifice the first thing he sees when he comes home, thinking he'll see a sheep or a cow or something. And daughter dearest walks out. And so what does he do? Well, he says, I'm going to have to kill you, daughter. I'm going to sacrifice you. And she says, well, let me have a little period of time here to go out with my friends and wrap my head around this and lament my virginity, which is an indicator in that culture. Even though you had Deborah the judge and Jael the heroine earlier, the important thing about being a female in the culture is whether you bear children or not. And since she's a virgin and won't ever bear a child, that needs to be wept for before she dies. Not so big a deal. I'm going to die, but I need to weep for never being a mother, which is an interesting cultural thing. This is a sad story. There's really no great way of spinning it. It's probably supposed to be an indicator things are not always going so great in the period of Judges. People make rash vows to God and take out their own kids in sacrifice. Thoughts about that? That's a rough piece of Judges there. All right, then we get the Samson saga. The Samson saga, I have a warm place in my heart for Samson. This was actually, when I was a kid, this was the first part of the Bible I tried to read. Because, Samson, big, strong superhero guy. Who was it in the 50s movie? Victor Mature, I think, that played Samson. And, big macho. I had comic books, and Samson's very much a comic book figure. But he's a little more complicated than, some comic book heroes are getting much more complicated these days than they used to be when I was a kid. But the Samson saga is a little more complicated. In fact, you have a real question. Is Samson a hero or not? Is he really a good judge or not? Or is he a prototype of a bad judge also, kind of like Abimelech? And the answer is kind of, he's kind of good in some ways, kind of not so great in other ways. Certainly, Samson is powerful, and his power comes from God. That's clear. He's been endowed with this power, but he doesn't use it wisely. He's shrewd, but he's not wise. He's witty, but not wise. And that's a fascinating juxtaposition with Samson. He never leads an army. He never amasses other people. He really is a lone ranger. He's a powerful lone ranger. He can wreak great havoc amongst lots of Philistines and lots of other enemies. but he's not raising up an army to unite the people against the Philistines. It's Samson versus the Philistines, basically. So is he a judge? Is he not a judge? Well, that's a good question. He never leads others. Plus, he has no impulse control. He acts very rashly. So hero or not? Hero, or he's more than a zero, but is he a hero or anti-hero? That's a live question with Samson. A couple other things. We've got Samson born to a barren couple. That is not the first time we've seen that in the scripture, nor will it be the last. You know, all the way up through John the Baptist and his parents, Samuel and his mother, barren couple, and then back with the patriarchs, we had barren issues. So Samson is in that lineage of barren women, and having an angel come and announce that this couple is going to have a baby. The angel also directs them to make Samson a Nazirite. There's question about whether John the Baptist also might be a Nazirite. Nazirites usually take a temporary vow to dedicate themselves to God, but it seems Samson is dedicated as a Nazirite from birth. He's not going to touch alcohol. He's not going to touch grapes if he's a Nazirite, and he'll not cut his hair. Well, Samson's not very good about keeping those vows. He drinks and carouses right, left, and sideways. And eventually his hair does get cut. That's the Delilah piece later on. His hair gets cut and his strength kind of dissipates. So that's the only Nazirite vow he really keeps, and he doesn't even keep that one. So he's not a good Nazirite. He's not a great judge. He's not a great Nazirite, but he's kind of this wild, cool folk hero with this power. Real quick, in Samson, he marries a Philistine, tells a riddle, witty, gets tricked by the wife, kills some of the, he loses the bet. And so in order to get the garments to pay off the bet, he kills a bunch of Philistines and takes their clothes off their back. Later, he ties a bunch of tails torches between tails of foxes and sets them loose in Philistine fields. There's a scene where he gets ambushed and he picks up a donkey's jawbone and uses that as a weapon. Another scene, he's with a prostitute, gets locked into the city. They think they got him trapped in the city of Gaza, and he pulls the gates off the hinges and carries him up way into the country and drops him on a hill. So these great feats of strength, but this is not really a heroic guy. He's doing great things, wild things, big things, but he's caught with a hooker and he rips the gates off the city and carries them off. Okay, well, is that heroic? Is that helping God's cause? Well, good question. Eventually he is tricked by Delilah. Wonderful scene there. She tricks him into revealing the source of his strength is his hair. She shears his hair off. They blind him, they capture him, they put him to work as an animal, basically milling grain. But eventually, at the end, they bring him out to make fun of him in the Philistine temple. He asks to be put by the central pillars, and he pushes them out. He asks for his strength to be brought back one more time, not for any great reason, but to take out his enemies. Revenge, God, give me my strength back. And his strength is given him, and he pushes the pillars down. He's killed. The Philistines are killed. So he wipes out Philistines. So is he a great judge? Maybe, maybe not. But he does take out a lot of Philistines throughout his one-man wrecking crew, Lone Ranger career. So Samson, interesting figure. So in some ways, there are a lot of scholars that think, Samson is really indicative that the judge pattern has fallen apart towards the end here, because the judge is not doing great judgely things. And at the end, things get even worse. There's a story about a Levite named Micah. It's not the later prophet Micah, different Micah, that sets himself up as a mercenary priest for hire to the highest bidder. Not a good situation when Levites do that. Another story about the Levites and the concubine. This is a nasty story. It's almost like Sodom and Gomorrah parallel. He's warned not to go and stay in the city. He stays anyway. The populace comes to rape him. He just shoves his concubine out the door and locks it behind her. And she is brutally gang raped all night long and crawls back up on the door stoop in the morning. She's dead. And then he cuts up her body into 12 chunks and sends 12 messengers out to the 12 tribes and says, this is bad, y'all. We got to do something about this. And they come and they wipe out that city. Very brutal story. If Deborah is a high point for feminism in the book of Judges, the Levite's concubine is the low point for what happens to women in the book of Judges. Nasty, nasty story. Nothing that is defensible at all, and probably supposed to be indicative of how badly things have fallen apart towards the end of the book of Judges. All right, the basic takeaway of the whole book is that, you know, having a king other than God is not a good thing. God should be our king. We should follow him. But if y'all are going to act this way, maybe a king is a necessary evil because things are really bad otherwise. And so it kind of sets up the monarchy coming up, that, you know, the monarchy is going to need to be a divinely structured monarchy. It needs to be different than the other monarchies around them. But maybe it's not going to be such a bad thing because things have been nasty in the time of the Judges. Real quick, I want to get to the book of Ruth because that's a delightful book in contrast to the book of Judges, which is kind of a violent, tough book. Any questions or thoughts? I can't see everybody, so shout out if you got one. All right, delightful book of Ruth. Ruth, we don't know when Ruth was written. Oh, that's the Judges slide here. Okay, here's the Ruth slides. I should have proofread this a little bit. Ruth is a prequel to the King David saga, probably not written at all by the DH historian, much later book, maybe a much later book. But because, in fact, in the Jewish Bible, it's much later. It's not in this section of the Bible. It's in a later section called the Writings. But because it happens in the time of Judges and is a prequel to the time of King David, Christian Bibles have it slotted in because of the timeline setting and nothing else. It is a subversive book. It seems to have a tough message, and it was written after the time of Samuel and Kings, and how much after is a live scholarly question. But it's also got a lot of tenderness to it. It's a very warm, wonderful book, and then a surprise O. Henry Zinger of an ending here. And maybe it's the greatest short story in the Old Testament. Short book, four short chapters. First, we have a account of Naomi's family. Naomi comes from Bethlehem. She moves off to Moab with her husband and sons, and all the guys immediately die. They marry foreign women there, and then they die. And so Naomi and her two daughters-in-law are left with no sons. Naomi's sons are dead, and Naomi's husband's dead. So in that culture where, you know, your identity comes from having children and your men are important to you for your identity, no men in the system, this is a different kind of book. And so you've got Naomi with these two foreign daughters-in-law, and Naomi decides to return to Bethlehem. She says, "My dears, go back to your dad's families and find some new husbands. You know, you've been very nice to stick with me in my grief, but you know, I'm a dried up old prune," basically. She says, don't stick with me. You're young, go off and have babies. The one daughter-in-law does, but Ruth says, nope, I'm gonna stick with you. You know, we've got a relationship now, and I'm gonna be loyal to you. Where you go, I'll go. If you want to move, I'll move with you. Your God will be my God, your people will be my people. In fact, that's sometimes inscribed on things. There's even pieces of jewelry where they'll write those words and then split them into two pieces of jewelry, and two people will carry those words. Very loyal. Ruth is going to stick with her mother-in-law through thick or thin. Where you go, I'll go. Where you live, I'll live. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Very, very bulldog loyalty from Ruth. Ruth is a foreigner, and yet she's going to adopt this God of Israel and stick with her mother-in-law. High marks to Ruth. Ruth is acting much more ethically and much more loyally than her culture demands. And wonderful person is the takeaway from those two chapters. Okay, so you got these two widows back in the land of Israel, no husbands, no real means of supporting themselves. Enter Boaz. Ruth goes out to glean in the fields. The law said you're supposed to not completely harvest things, leave stuff on the fringes for the poor to come and glean in your fields. And so Ruth is doing that. She catches Boaz's eye. And Boaz, it turns out, we don't know this initially, but Boaz turns out to be the second closest relative to Naomi's dead husband. That'll come into play later. Second closest relative. And he takes a liking to her before all this is known. He gives his servants instructions to help her out. Leave a little extra grain over here when you harvest, so Ruth can pick it up. he acts very honorably. Ruth is acting very honorably. They're a very honorable, wonderful couple is the takeaway message. In that culture, if a guy dies, the next nearest male relative should take in the wife, marry the wife, and raise up children to his dead relative. And so that's going to come into play here in a minute. Boaz seems to be a little bit shy. And so Naomi encourages Ruth to take some initiative. And there's a big harvest festival, and Boaz gets drunk. And Naomi encourages Ruth to go and uncover Boaz's feet. Feet is often a euphemism for genitals in the Old Testament. So it's probably a seduction scene, a nice romantic seduction scene, but Ruth is taking more initiative than is usual in her culture. She's more loyal than in her culture, and she's a little more forward here, and in a good way. And Boaz covers her up with his robe, which indicates they probably have a sexual union that evening. And so it's kind of a proposition for marriage, and Boaz takes her up on it basically, but says we've got one problem. There is one closer male relative, and Boaz has to clear things with him. Boaz is very clever. He goes to the guy and says, you know that farm over there that our late relative had? One of us needs to take it over. And the guy says, you're first in line. Do you want it? The guy says, yeah. Oh yeah, there's a widow attached to it. You got to marry her. The guy says, never mind. You want her? Okay. So Boaz gets to marry Ruth. Boaz is very slick in setting that up so that the good outcome he wants comes about. And so he gets to marry Ruth. And then we got the wonderful zinger at the end. They turn out to be King David's great-grandparents. David has a Moabite as a great-grandmother. He is not of pure Jewish lineage. So other people can come in to the Jewish people and be incorporated in, and that's okay. And probably when Ruth was written, there are various pushbacks against foreigners being part of Israel. There's push and pull in various times of Israel's history. This is probably written in one of those times, maybe even the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, saying, you guys are putting away your foreign wives. Well, look, David had a foreign great-grandmother, and she was a wonderful lady, a paragon of virtue, maybe a little forward in her proposal of marriage, but other than that, great lady. And so maybe you're too hasty in pushing back on foreigners. So that seems to very much be the theme of Ruth. And like Rahab in the book of Joshua, Ruth does hit our Christmas story in the book of Matthew. Ruth is one of the 4 female ancestors of King David. They're mentioned explicitly in the book of Matthew in his genealogy. All of them, there are things that are outside the norms of normal romantic and sexual behavior with all of them. Rahab's a prostitute. Tamar pretends to be a prostitute. Uriah is raped. Ruth takes some initiative sexually. And then we've got this 5th female relative, I talked about this last week, who shows up pregnant out of wedlock. Well, an angel announces it, and God and the Holy Spirit have something to do with it, but it's unusual as well. So Ruth does make part of the Christmas story every year with when we read in Advent Matthew's genealogy of Jesus. All right, so wonderful, wonderful book. Probably a nicer place to close with Ruth than with Judges, as we are getting towards the end of Advent here, 3rd Sunday in Advent, week and a half till Christmas. So thoughts or comments or questions here from any of y'all? Y'all can't be this quiet this way. Eric, usually y'all are always full of wonderful stuff. Jimmy's reaching for something. You got a question, Jimmy? Or oh no, Abby, yay, Abby.
This is not a question. It's just I really did not care for this book. These people behave horribly, and there's very few redeeming qualities in most of these stories.
And I think that's exactly what you're supposed to see. You know, things are not good, and they're getting worse and worse and worse. They're kind of, there's some military heroism involved with a number of them, but there are a lot of flaws, and a lot of times the heroism does not make up for the flaws and the bad behavior, and it gets worse. Yeah, Bob.
Wouldn't it be a continuing warning against worshiping other gods? I mean, we how much of our time during the week, of the however many hours a week there are, do we spend thinking about worshiping God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit? How much of our time do we spend worshiping the other gods? The good news is, hopefully, we won't be invaded anytime soon. I saw it real quick, kind of an offbeat parallel. The judges in the book of Judges, they're kind of like a terrible comic book analogy that maybe Jimmy and Father Jim will get. The series of Judge Dredd, the comic book. He's judge, jury, and executioner walking around. You know, you're a bad guy. Out of here.
Take you out, Judge Dredd. That's funny. That's fine. Well, Samson almost is kind of a Judge Dredd type figure. I never thought about that. Well, he is a judge, jury, executioner all by himself.
My brain goes many different places.
That's funny, Bob. But I think y'all are right. These folks, as much as like the superhero aspects of Samson, and I think Branson has a Samson play that's kind of got him as a big superhero type guy. So you know, that's, you know, as a kid I was attracted to that, but this is not an attractive book overall. You know, there's some Gideon's trumpet, wonderful moment, but that, you know, there are these little flashes of cool things in Judges, but it's a downward, or I guess left to right, downward trajectory all the way through the book. So I think we're very much needing to see that something needs to give, and the something will need to give will come in the next section with Samuel, the last judge and the first great prophet will arise. Regina, you had your hand up there.
I was just going to say that Samson is a character who appears in classical music throughout European history as well. He's, you know, a fascinating character, and so good opera can be written about characters like that. Yeah,
operas and oratorios are all, you know, are often, you know. Do we want to sing about Jesus again? That's kind of boring. He's kind of, there's no action there, but oh, we've got sex and violence. Let's do that. So yeah, they're often mined by the culture for those kinds of things, and Hollywood 50s movies too. I mean, they certainly go with that.
Jim?
Yes.
How did, in the Christian Bible, did Ruth come to be after this, just as a segue into the David saga?
Exactly.
Because it's such a nice balm after Judges, you know.
It was just stuck in there because it fit chronologically. You know, the Jewish section considers Judges part of the prophets, the early prophets, and Ruth is one of the later writings. But the Christian group kind of saw this more as historical books, and so we kind of slotted Ruth into the historical slot where she would go in the timeline. And that's all.
So where is Ruth then in a Jewish Bible?
It's off in the third section with Psalms and Job and Proverbs.
Okay, with the
Esther,
like with the Proverbs and that
all those other writings, yeah.
The writings, okay.
Yes, Jimmy.
Oh, I was just gonna say, but somehow for millennia, the people of God have seen this as scripture and God's word and needed to take it as, at least in some way. And but yeah, as horrifying as the book of Judges is, it's still somehow God's word that needs to be, is part of scripture.
Well, it is, and I think the theological takeaway is if you're not following God, you know, things are not going to go tremendously well, and that's a very strong piece there. And there are you know, Gideon's trying to follow God. There's no doubt about that. He's one of the better judges, but his son certainly is not. So, oh, Rachel's wishing me happy 25th. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you. Appreciate that. Well, awesome, y'all. Well, I'll say this in church. You know, when I saw that my 25th ordination anniversary would be on a Sunday, I was looking forward to that at the beginning of the year, and because it's always wonderful to be with people as a priest. With COVID, I'm not going to be with everybody in the same way, but wonderful to be with you all in this way. Wonderful to have this discussion in this time, and I really I've really been enjoying this, going through the Old Testament like this. So looking forward, we'll take 3 weeks off. January 10th, we'll pick up with the books of Samuel and go forward from there. We'll also, just so you know, in the second semester, the book is going to be incorporating prophets in more chronologically. So we'll be dealing with a lot of other things as we go through. He'll be slipping in pieces of things that kind of fit the timeline as we go. So it'll get a little more complicated from that standpoint, but it'll flow. So looking forward to that, and good to see you all, and we'll see you in 2021 for this venue, for this class on January 10th.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Anniversary, Jim.
Thank you.